Someone commented that this is not church. You could have sat farther forward. I have been asked to reprise a lecture that was given at the beginning of the history unit, How Do We Create and Use the Past? It was given for 6 years, from 2000 to 2005, which means that only about a quarter of you have heard of it, and perhaps even fewer of you have any memories of it. There is, therefore, a certain risk involved here. Those of you who remember the point of the lecture will appreciate that memories are complicated things, often contested and always partial. And so a reprise it's a tricky thing, even for a musician, and even if you have a good tune. There was a novelist, I think, who warned about trying to go home again. But the problem that we face here this evening is more complicated than usual. And it's complicated by what has been this nation's experience over the last 5 months. The primary example in this lecture was a proposed temporary exhibit for the Smithsonian in 1995. And given the current pressure for interpretive compliance that's being placed on the entire Smithsonian, all its exhibits, and even more pointedly on the African American and the Native American museums, and the planning for the forthcoming women's and Latino museums, not to mention similar arm twisting on universities, national parks, scientific research, and just about everything else. I have some fear that that 1995 example will appear almost laughably inconsequential. If the head of the Smithsonian today had only to worry about one fleeting temporary exhibit, I think you would hear a sigh of relief from sea to shining sea. And over the last few weeks, I've come close to saying no reprise. I'll write an entirely new lecture on something else. But in the end, I decided to do what I had been asked to do, and that is to reprise the lecture. But you are forewarned. The passage of 25 years has not been kind to it. And what I would say to you is this. Let this be a reminder that you and I learned and taught in more innocent times, when it was possible for professors to assign readings and for all of us to sit in Whitmire and speak our minds without political interference. How blessed we were. So what do I propose to do? The original lecture had 4 parts, and the first 3 of these you will hear unchanged. The introductory rhetoric, the theoretical foundation, which I think is still persuasive and perhaps even more so now, and then the dated example from the 1995 World War II exhibit. The 4th part, the inevitable what therefore should we do, is new for tonight. So here it is. Memory and the historical imagination. From the beginning, we humans have tried to remember. From the Paleolithic paintings scrawled painstakingly on the walls of a cave in southern France, to the gigabytes that we post-human souls manipulate in our computers, we humans have left our marks, built our memorials, and tried to remember. They had been in the wilderness for 40 years, the tribes of Israel had. 40 years following a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And now at last, carrying the Ark of the Covenant before them, they crossed over the Jordan into the Promised Land. And as they did, Joshua told 12 men, one from each tribe, each to take a great stone from the middle of the river, carry it out of the Jordan and onto the place where they camped that first night. And there at Gilgal, they set the 12 stones up, stone upon stone, to make, so the tradition has it, a memorial in their midst. Why? So that they could remember. So when their children and their children's children saw those stones and asked, "What do these stones mean?" they too would hear the story. Memory, a tradition, and an identity. More than 3,000 years later, William Penn prepared to build a city on the banks of another river, and he too remembered. He remembered the bubonic plague that had ravaged London in 1665 and the fire that had burned it the following year. And so when Penn planned a new town, he said, "I wish it to be a green country town, which will never be burnt and will always be wholesome." Penn remembered, too, the Christian testimonies of the Society of Friends. His would be a city of brotherly love, a city that would welcome diversity, and all who came there would live in harmony. There would be no city walls, no fortification, no soldiers. Memory, a vision, a hope for the future. Not quite 200 years later, some miles farther west, a tall, gaunt man stood on a platform outside another Pennsylvania town. "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here," Lincoln predicted, "but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom." Memory, an admonition, a commitment. Yesterday, a late spring day in Washington, a veteran with now faded medals pinned to the lapel of her jacket made her way slowly, almost reverently, along a black wall until she came to the place and paused to trace the letters of a name with her finger. And she remembered. Memory, comfort, and finally peace. So from the beginning, I say, we humans have tried to remember. But what? What do we remember? And how? And to what purpose? Historians, as you might expect, are interested in memory. We are, of course, not alone in our interest, but others are interested, yes, but we historians, you might say, have made something of a specialty of it. Now, early generations of historians were mostly interested in the accuracy of memory. They, like other scholars of their time, assumed that the mind stored away little bits of information, little reproductions of reality, and the task was to access them, rather like retrieving something from the attic. But more recently, and particularly since the 1980s, scholars in all fields have made remarkable strides in the understanding of memory. And what impresses them is that memory is more an act of construction than retrieval, more creation than reproduction. What's the core question? How do we create the past? We reshape, omit, distort, combine, reorganize details from the past in an active and subjective way, one historian writes. And we do it both as individuals and as a culture. What we have learned in the first place is that recollection is inseparable from the purpose of recollection. What we remember and why we remember are indissolubly linked. What's the other part of the core question? How do we use the past? And use affects memory. As new needs arise or intended uses change, then we remember things differently. In the words of Jean Piaget, If we change the way we think about the world, we automatically update memories to reflect our new understanding. Second thing we have learned, and just as intriguing, is that memory is affected by social interaction. It is seldom, perhaps never, a solitary construction. We depend on each other, you see, to help us decide what experience to remember, what experiences to forget, and what interpretation to place on them. And so we have come to understand, we 20th century students, you and I, the complexity of memory as a social construct. Now, this is all very well and good, and if we think about it, it's consistent with everyday experience. Not everyone remembers the same things or remembers the same things in the same way. As those of you who are now practicing attorneys and judges can probably attest. All well and good, but it does complicate things. If memory has a constructed communal aspect, then a nation's memory has a political quality. And in a nation the size of the United States, we are probably talking not about a single memory, but about memories, plural, battling for space in the public consciousness. So let me tell you about one such battle that occurred in 1995. I call it the second bombing of Hiroshima. And it's a story of different memories competing for space in the public mind. It had been 50 years since that fateful day, August 6, 1945, when the first of two bombs fell on Japan. And the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum had planned a special 50-year commemorative exhibit. The restored forward section of the Enola Gay, a prototype of the bomb, memorabilia, a melted watch with hands frozen on the moment of explosion, photographs of survivors, historical explanations. But after seeing early drafts of the exhibit, veterans groups denounced it as anti-American. The Enola Gay's pilot called it a package of insults. And the controversy spread across newspaper editorial pages, onto talk shows, into the halls of Congress. Members of the House started a petition, the Senate passed a resolution calling it offensive, and in the end, what the Smithsonian historians planned to say was withdrawn, heads rolled, and only a bland, smaller exhibit went on display. What do we make of this? I mean, how could people's historical memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki diverge so dramatically that rational discussion was no longer possible? Well, here's the setting. As the United States forces advanced toward Japan in 1945, it was assumed that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would be necessary. And the projected date was November 1945 for Japan's southern island Kyushu, and March 1946 for the main island Honshu. Planners expected heavy casualties, maybe 200,000. Pessimists thought maybe 1 million. And this in a theater of war that had so far cost the United States less than 40,000. The traditional view expressed by President Truman is that we dropped the bomb to save lives. Simple choice, simple arithmetic. Either invade and the deaths are in the millions, or drop 2 bombs and the deaths are in the thousands. No brainer. You drop the bomb to end the killing. The traditional view, you drop the bomb to save lives. But by 1995, 50 years later, more archival records became available to historians, and we knew 2 other things. First, Japan had been trying to surrender for about 2 months before the bombings. She was asking for certain terms, and we were still asking for unconditional surrender, and so there was no deal. But the existence of the surrender overtures does complicate the issue. Many U.S. strategists were predicting that the war would be over well before November, and certainly before March. Bomb or no bomb, the invasions weren't likely to happen. And even if they did, Japan's resistance was unlikely to be so stiff as predicted, and thus the casualties not so high. And besides, it was 2 months until November. What was the hurry? Second, the Soviet Union was scheduled to declare war on Japan on August 8, 1945, at our request. Why? Well, back in the winter months of 1944-1945, when we were planning the invasion, we were frightened by those projected casualty figures. And so we began to look for a partner, for someone to attack Japan from the other side and share the pain. And the only possible choice was Communist Russia, which had yet to enter the Asian half of the war. Stalin said he could not help us at all while he was still fighting Hitler. But in February 1945 at Yalta, in a secret, unannounced agreement with American negotiators, he promised to attack 3 months from the date of Hitler's surrender, whenever that turned out to be. It was May 8, and so 3 months later was August 8. Now, this complicates matters even more. According to some strategists in Washington, if Japan was teetering anyway, Russia's invasion would surely be the last straw. Once Japan found that she was fighting both of us, it would be all over. And so why, if you know Japan is attacking on August 8th, do you drop a bomb on August 6th? You can't wait 2 days to find out if Russia's entry tips the balance and the war is over. But you see, that's the point. The Soviet Union was our ally, but as a communist nation, it was not our friend. And during the European war against Hitler, we had squabbled, and as the war neared its end, we elbowed each other for position in the post-war world. And in the aftermath, we couldn't agree on anything, and the result was a divided Germany and a divided Europe. So in February, we were begging Russia to help us invade Japan, but by mid-July, we had an atomic bomb, and that gave us another option to finish off Japan. An historian named Gar Alperovitz, in a very famous 1965 book, Atomic Diplomacy, argued that the bombs were not aimed solely at Japan. They were also aimed at Russia. It was because, he argued, Russia was entering the war that we dropped the bombs. We wanted to end the war instantly before Japan could gobble up territory, before we ended up with a North and South Japan, as well as an East and West Germany. Or worse yet, before Russia got to Japan while we were still stuck on some tiny Pacific island. And then Russia would get credit for the victory. And another side benefit, Alperovitz argues, is that we made it very plain to the Russians that we would use that bomb. Now, this was the explanation by Gar Alperovitz that the Smithsonian exhibit wanted to put up on the wall in one of the panels next to Truman's explanation and say to the public, what do you think? Which was right. And all hell broke loose. Why? Because memories of the event were so different. To a corporal out on a Pacific island in 1945, the news of the bomb was salvation. And the memory was simple and indelible. That bomb saved my life. I got to go home alive. But back safely behind a desk in official Washington, there was no need to explain personal survival. The thoughts were of strategy, not rescue. They knew of Japanese surrender overtures. They knew the end was only a matter of time. Their minds were racing ahead. Their concern was not only Japan, but also what the Russian intervention would do to the post-war balances of power and the world's memories of who won the war. And so Dwight Eisenhower could say later that if it were only Japan, we didn't have to drop that god-awful thing. So now how do you square those two memories? The memories of G.I. Joe and General of the Army's Dwight Eisenhower. And you see, that's the trouble. Our personal narratives are limited, and we're allowed to see and to understand only what circumstances our upbringings will permit. We see through a glass darkly, but that is all. Now, there's an important caution that has to be inserted here. Memory, I have said, is often contested and always partial, but that does not mean that we can treat it with indifference. We can't just make up any old tale about the past and say it won't matter much. We cannot, for instance, imagine that the bombs never fell, or that the Holocaust never happened. There is a reality against which our memories are tested. We aren't writing a fairy tale or a fantasy novel. Now, none of us, either individually or as a group, has a privileged platform from which we can see the whole of reality. Those of you who read John Gaddis's book, The Landscape of History, as common core reading for that history unit, know that he likens historians to landscape painters. We all are standing at a little different spot and looking at the subject from a little different angle, but there is a land out there that we're all trying to paint. And we bear responsibility for the quality and the consequences of the historical paintings that we create. We are obligated, therefore, to see that our memories and our narratives that we construct with them, though imperfect, are as comprehensive, as compassionate, and as all-embracing of reality as possible. How do we do this? Well, one way, I think, is to open ourselves and permit our stories to meet the stories of others, especially others different from ourselves. And out of those conversations, dialogues with others in our own time, and texts and monuments left by others from previous times, out of those larger and more generous personal narratives can emerge. That's what the Honors College is about, isn't it? We enlarged our personal understandings by contact with other minds, Plato, Hegel, Blake, Ruskin, Faulkner, Morrison, and by the interactions with people who sat around us in the Great Hall, joined us after core for lunch, stayed awake at night talking about almost anything. The dangerous memory is the one that is constructed in isolation from the experiences of others. So, what therefore should we do? Well, in the original lecture, I admonished you to participate in the communal shaping of our nation's memories, to engage in the political act of assuring that they remain as compassionate and connected to reality as possible. I hope you have done that and are still doing that, because it's certainly needed now more than ever. I also ask you to think about the memories that you were creating of your years here at IUP, and especially your years in the Honors College. The memories of the Great Hall that you would carry away with you. And I trust that you have been exchanging those memories in the hours you've been back together here this weekend. I also carry away memories from our time together in the Honors College, and I want to say something about how they have been useful to me. You know, of course, that I recently wrote a history of IUP. Should I say created a history of IUP? And I would say, I would echo, if you haven't bought one yet, heaven's sakes, what are you waiting for, all right? What are you waiting for? Where's your loyalty? And there are some pictures in there of students in the Great Hall and information about the Honors College and a picture of Dr. Goebel and Bob Cook. Buy one. Anyway, but let me try to explain how my time in the Honors College helped me to write that history, helped me to understand some of IUP's past. One of the challenges of creating history is getting inside the lives of those people who lived long before us, understanding what their experiences were really like. And as I sat in Stapleton Library, reading the archival record of IUP's earliest years when this building was the whole building, the whole place, I found my mind bouncing back and forth between the distant past and my experiences with the Honors College. You see, when this building was all there was, it united classrooms and sleeping quarters much in the same way that the Honors College did when I taught there. One difference was that even the faculty lived in the hall in those days, and I leave to your own imaginations to discern how such an arrangement would have changed our experiences in Whitmire. I think you can imagine wandering into the bathroom in the morning and there at the next sink is Dr. Begers with her toothbrush. That aside, much of what I was finding about those early days reminded me of our days together. And I'm convinced that the union of living and learning enhanced the results in both instances. And I regret that some of you haven't had quite that same experience, that because of construction and COVID and other things, you did not live in Whitmire as well as study and have classes there. Because I'm convinced that it mattered greatly that we faculty met you in your home, in your living space. In any case, I think I understand better what life and learning were like in this building in the 1880s, because I experienced the Honors College a century later. And listening to your memories, related in exit interviews and over drinks at previous reunions, have helped me comprehend the memories that were recorded by those very first Indiana students. Fortunately, those first Indiana students did record their memories. They left a thick book of reminiscences, written reminiscences, sent in, collected for the school's 50th anniversary, which, by the way, would be a worthy project for you folks for the university's 150th. Just say. But to read those written memories is to understand that the walls of this building are literally steeped with the hopes and the dreams of those first graduating classes, just as Whitmire's halls are steeped with yours. This room was their chapel. They assembled here daily for prayer. They ate downstairs in the same room where we will dine this evening. They studied and did practice teaching in the area that now houses the museum. They slept on the upper floors, as we will not do this evening. And they too carried away memories, and often memories of people. And many of them seemed to revolve around Jane Leonard, after whom now the third Leonard Hall is named. One alumnus in the class of 1883 wrote that every school of note owes its spirit, its essence, to some great personality. Rugby has its Arnold, Harvard it's Elliott, Princeton it's McCosh, Cornell it's White, and Indiana it's Leonard. Jane Leonard hovered over their lives. She gets an entire chapter to herself in my book. She came here to teach history in 1875 and eventually added literature and did not retire until 46 years later. And by then she was so much a part of this place that she was allowed to continue living here after her retirement. And she died in her sleep up here on the 3rd floor in 1924, and her funeral service was conducted in this very room. There's a large oil painting of her commissioned for the school's 25th anniversary in 1900. It hung first here in this room and now hangs in the hallway outside the Blue Room downstairs. Look at it with respect as you go past. I realized very quickly that to understand the early history of this school, I had to understand Jane Leonard. I mean, how was it that one woman, that's what everybody said, that one woman, by force of personality and dedication to excellence, could shape an institution so profoundly and lastingly? I mean, was that even possible? Or was this some kind of overblown myth that needed to be deflated? My time in the Honors College helped me to understand that puzzle too. I learned how one woman, by force of personality and dedication to excellence, could shape an institution so profoundly because I had the privilege of knowing and working with Janet Noble. I hope you understand how important she is. I chaired the initial planning committee for the Honors College. And the plan that was drafted was pretty vague. I went back and read it this week. It was written in a way that would get it through the university senate and past the council of trustees without getting anybody too upset. There was to be an honors college, but the curriculum for the place and the spirit of the place and even the place of the place, none of that was defined. I think we all assumed that we'd have some kind of a chronologically organized humanities course. Unit 1, Middle Ages. A few kings, some feudalism, a dash of scholastic philosophy, Beowulf, Song of Roland, a couple Gregorian chants, a couple Gothic arches, done. Next unit, on to the Renaissance. And rinse and repeat, keep going through all of this until by May we had reached the postmodern era. And we would have been no different than hundreds of honors colleges all over the United States. As to facilities, think we assumed in the plan that students would live in some wing or other of some dormitory somewhere. And we assumed that classes would be held where classes were always held, where faculty taught in classrooms. And the students would come to the faculty, not the faculty to the students. But you know, we got infinitely more than that. The HC's incredibly innovative curriculum with team teaching and those core questions, that's Janet Noble's doing. And the level of innovative excellence that got us noted by Don Asher in the Princeton Review, that's Janet Noble's doing. Putting the living and learning inside the same building and creating a stunningly beautiful space for it to flourish, that's Janet Noble's doing. One of the things that students remembered about Jane Leonard was that she simply could not have existed unless surrounded by art and beauty. And I think I understand how that might be, because I felt it in our founding director. And I suspect we were all shaped, more than we knew, by living and learning amidst the beautiful surroundings that she created in Whitmire Hall. The core characteristic of Jane Leonard, as I came to understand her, is that she always insisted on excellence, even if some thought she was overreaching. And more than anything else, students recalled that she taught them how to think. One student said, "She gave us the ability to see large things large and small things small." Leonard made her students write thesis papers and do peer reviews. Sound familiar? She took them from sheltered backgrounds and forced them out into the world. She insisted that they think big thoughts and dream big dreams. She encouraged them, maybe even badgered them, to be more ambitious. If you think Janet Goebel at times could be a bit overbearing with her advice, and let's face it, she could be, you should read Jane Leonard's words to her student Helen Wilson that I quote on page 104 in that book. And so many, many years later, what Leonard's students remembered most, and what I suspect maybe you remember most about the Honors College, what they remembered is that they had come here and been transformed. And so from the beginning, this has been the essence of an IUP education and an Honors College education. We came here and we were transformed. Because true education is always a transforming experience. You can't hold knowledge at arm's length. That's why the core questions always end with, what, therefore, should we do? You have to invite the knowledge in, let it become a part of who you are. And once you do that, you're different. You're not the same person. You have different, or some shall we say, reconstructed, or maybe even recreated memories. Now this is risky, even dangerous, but it's exciting, and it's what real education means. And it's the act by which memory and the historical imagination are most intimately connected together. Thank you. I do have one other story that I thought I ought to tell somebody. And that's where the idea for having an honors college was, where it came from. Somebody asked that, Bob Cook that this morning. And I can tell you that the idea was created standing in the hallway outside the door back here. In 1990, I was working here full-time, well, almost full-time, 3/4 release in the provost office as director of liberal studies. There was a new undergraduate curriculum that was being put in, and I was in charge of seeing that happened without too many things going wrong. And I had offices up on the 3rd floor, and one day I was on my way down to the provost office over here, and I got about halfway down the hall, and Hilda Richard, the provost, was coming the other way, and she said, "I'm looking for you." She says, "I want to talk with you." When your boss says that, you get a little nervous, but what she said is that the foundation has identified one of our alumni who has shown up on the list of the most wealthy people in Washington, D.C. And the president has made contact with him. He's willing to give money if we can decide what he should give it for. And we've suggested, he's in computers, we suggested something for the computer science department. He said, "No way." He's in business, well, something for the College of Business. "No way, not interested." "How about a building?" "Nothing about books and nothing about bricks." And it became clearer, President Welty said that when he went to dinner with that man, he said it was the hardest he had ever worked at a dinner in his whole life, because the conversation went from Plato to quarks and back again. And it was clear that it had to have something to do with ideas. And Hilda Richards said to me, she said, this new in liberal studies curriculum, is there something in there that we could maybe use? And we talked a little bit, and there were some innovative, creative things in there, writing across the curriculum. There was an innovative, interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary senior seminar. But we had those things all funded, and we're all doing it. We never convinced the man to give us money for something that we don't need money for. And she said, when Arlo Davis's committee created that new curriculum, did they have any other ideas that didn't get into it? And I said, well, yeah, there was. We did talk about the fact that it'd be nice to have an honors track, a separate, where we could have a more creative curriculum than you could create for 12,000 students. Hilda Richard just about leaped up in the air. She said, that's it. She said, I am sick and tired of going to Harrisburg and being the only school other than Cheney that doesn't have some kind of a university-wide honors college. She said, go upstairs and write something up. And I think it was probably midnight by the time I got home that night. And the next day I went down to the foundation, to the fundraising people, and sat down with Betsy DeGore, who was the chief major gifts person at that time, and we wrote up a proposal that John Welding could take to Bob Cook, and he loved the idea of an honors college. So it got started out in the hallway out here, outside these doors.
If it started with you guys talking, how did Dr. Gold get into it?
Dr. Gold, once Bob Cook said he would send money, then Hilda Richards appointed a committee to come up with a plan for the Honors College. And she was on that committee. I chaired the committee as Director of Liberal Studies. And we started working then, it would have been in the spring of '91. We had a preliminary report to the president. One went out to the whole university over the summer, and by the next spring of '92 that it finally got through the Senate. But it was vague. And then I went off. My job as Liberal Studies Director, that term was up, and I was headed to sabbatical, and I was going to Europe to do research. I wasn't going to hang around here. And so Hilda Richard needed somebody to become the first director of this and take this kind of bland plan and turn it into something. And it was Dr. Gold. And so she worked, the first of you showed up here in the fall of '96, right? So there's actually about a 4-year period in there where, you're working on Whitmire, and all that work was done to create the curriculum and so forth like that, yeah. And it was a brilliant choice, really, because she's disappeared, so I can say this about her. You know her well enough to know that she always pushes the boundaries. And sometimes those of us around don't like being pushed, but she does that. And I remember sitting in with Hilda Richards, and we were talking about who would be appointed to the first director. And Hilda said, yeah, I hear these things that she's not always easy to work with, that she's going to push hard, and she's hard to satisfy. It's hard to get everything. And Hilda stopped, and she says, but she says, I think that's what we want, don't we? Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, after President Pettit left, there was a time in there where we had interns coming and going, and there was about a few years of really topsy-turvy administration. And I think not everybody in charge in those years would have answered that question the same way that Hilda Richards did, that yeah, that's what we want. So I think her job wasn't as easy as a couple of years ago. But we should be very, and wherever this new honors college ends up, I mean, new place for it, whenever it gets up, there needs to be a picture of that woman hanging in there, just saying. Okay? It's time to eat.